Paul stood at the edge of the plot. His boots sank into the cracked, parched earth, the dry ground shifting like broken glass beneath his weight. The valley stretched out before him, a vast, silent expanse of yellowed dust under a relentless, white-hot sun. There was no movement here, only the shimmer of heat rising from the ridges. Paul gripped the handle of the rusted hoe. He swung it down with everything he had. The blade hit a buried rock, the impact jarring his shoulders and sending a sharp vibration through his teeth. The ground did not yield. He pulled the tool back, his knuckles tight, and swung again. The dust puffed up in a choking cloud, stinging his eyes and coating his throat. He did not step back. He swung a third time, then a fourth, the metal biting into the hardpan with a dull, ringing thud. The silence of the valley was absolute, pressing in against his ears, broken only by his own heavy, rhythmic breathing. He looked down at the small, shallow gouge in the earth. It was barely a scratch, but he held his ground. He adjusted his grip and prepared for the next strike. A rumble of engines cut through the valley's silence. Paul stood upright, leaning on his tool as the dusty road filled with a low hum of heavy transit. At the junction, 3 buses idled. Through the tinted glass, he saw faces, friends, and neighbors he had known since childhood. They were headed toward the distant neon glow of factory hubs, toward steady wages and climate-controlled floors. The buses pulled away one by one, trailing plumes of exhaust that hung motionless in the dry air. The sound faded until the valley returned to its stifling quiet. No one looked back. He watched the final tail light disappear over the ridge, leaving a void where the crowd had been. He was the only one left on the perimeter of the township. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, pressing against his chest. He looked at the vast, unyielding slope of his grandfather's land. The choice was made. There was no one else to clear the rocks, no one else to drag the water, and no one else to wait for the rain. He turned his back on the empty road and looked down at the earth. Paul planted his feet wide, bracing his core for the effort. He gripped the handle of the rusted hoe, his palms slick with sweat despite the dry heat. He raised the iron blade high above his head, the metal catching the harsh glare of the sun. With a sharp exhale, he brought it down with full force. The blade struck the earth, but instead of sinking, it shuddered against a buried stone. The impact traveled up the shaft, vibrating through his wrists and jarring his shoulders with a stinging, metallic shock. His grip slipped, and he staggered back half a step. The ground remained unbroken, a stubborn wall of packed silt and stone. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, the silence of the valley mocking his attempt. He looked at the mark on the surface, a shallow, jagged scratch. He tightened his fingers around the wood until his knuckles turned white. He did not step back. He adjusted his stance, shifted his weight, and raised the hoe once more. He focused on the exact point of the previous impact, his eyes narrowed against the dust. He knew the resistance was not a sign to quit, but a test of the ground itself. He braced his legs, drew a breath, and prepared to strike again. The second swing landed with a dull, heavy thud. This time, the rock shifted. It groaned against the blade, rolling aside and leaving a dark, jagged fissure in the parched crust. Paul lunged forward to regain his balance, his weight carrying him into the newly opened gap. He hit the dust on his knees, hands plunging into the grit. He did not pause to brush the dirt away. He stood, feet planted firmly in the depression he had just created, and swung again. The rhythm took hold. Up, arc, strike. The wood handle scraped his palms, leaving raw patches of skin, but he ignored the sting. Each impact shattered another fragment of the hard-packed surface. Below the top layer, the soil was even tighter, resisting his efforts like concrete. He gritted his teeth, focused every ounce of energy into the center of his swing, and hammered the blade down. The earth yielded. A pile of loose, dark dirt began to grow between his boots. He did not look at the sun or the horizon. He looked only at the ground. Swing after swing, the trench deepened, carving a path into the land. He was no longer fighting the ground, he was commanding it to open. By the time he stopped, a long, furrowed line stretched out before him, a testament to his refusal to walk away. The alarm did not ring. Paul woke to the absolute silence of 4 a.m. His muscles stiffened as he moved, a dull ache radiating from his shoulders down to his lower back. He sat up, the air in the room biting and thin. He did not linger. He pulled on his boots, the leather cold and rigid against his skin. Outside, the valley was a sea of ink, indistinguishable from the sky. He stepped into the yard, the ground still holding the chill of the night. His routine was a cycle of bone-deep fatigue. He walked to the field, his gait heavy and measured. He did not think about the harvest or the end of the season. He thought only about the next hour. He picked up his tools, the iron handle familiar and biting in his grip. The sun began its slow crawl toward the horizon, casting a pale, sickly light over the dust. He worked, his movements mechanical, each action repeated until the sun reached its peak and began its long descent. Day after day, the pattern remained the same. He pushed his body until the limit of his endurance was reached. Then he pushed further, carving his resolve into the very dirt he sought to change. The well was a hollow throat in the middle of the parched valley. Paul leaned over the rim, the wood splintering under his weight. He dropped the bucket. It clattered against the stone walls, a long, hollow descent before the splash. It sounded thin, distant, and wrong. He yanked the rope, the hemp biting into his palms, and hauled the load toward the light. The bucket broke the surface only half full, the water muddy and smelling of stagnant minerals. He emptied it into a barrel, his movements fluid but labored. He repeated the process. Each time, the rope grew heavier, or perhaps his strength simply leaked away. His forearms began to pulse with a dull, rhythmic ache. By the 10th trip, his hands shook violently. He gripped the edge of the well to steady himself, his knuckles white against the dark stone. He looked down into the depths. The water was retreating, pulling back into the earth like a frightened animal. He dropped the bucket again. The sound of the splash was fainter than before. He pulled, his muscles burning, every fiber of his being resisting the exhaustion. He kept going, dragging the heavy, wet weight up, 1 inch at a time, until the bucket cleared the rim and his arms finally gave way, trembling uncontrollably in the morning air. The well was dry, but his ambition remained. Paul turned away from his own dust-choked plot to find work elsewhere. He arrived at the neighboring farm before dawn, his hands still calloused from his own morning chores. He spent the day hauling timber, his back straining under the weight of heavy, rough-hewn beam issue. The sun hammered down, turning the air into a furnace. He did not slow down. He took the jobs others refused, clearing rocks, digging drainage ditches, and mending broken fences in the heat. By sunset, his muscles were knots of fire. He accepted the payment, a few coins pressed into his palm, and walked home. He sat by the light of a single flickering lamp, counting the currency. He separated the coins with surgical precision, a portion for bread, a portion for basic needs, and the rest moved into a heavy leather pouch. This was the compost. This was the seed. He recorded every cent in a ledger, tracking his progress against the cost of the supplies he needed. Each coin represented a promise to the earth. He tucked the pouch under a loose floorboard, his eyes fixed on the empty rows of his field. He was not just surviving, he was building, one day of labor at a time. The heavy burlap bags rested against his thigh, their weight a promise finally kept. Paul walked to the center of the plot. The sun was a low white glare on the horizon. He opened the first bag. The smell of rich, dark compost rose to meet him, a stark contrast to the sterile dust of the valley. He knelt. He poured the nutrients into the rows he had cleared, his fingers sifting through the mixture to ensure an even spread. Then came the seeds. They were small, hard, and light, sliding against his calloused skin. He measured the distance between each drop with steady, practiced movements. The soil was stubborn, packed tight by years of neglect. He pushed his index finger into the earth, but the crust held firm. He grabbed his small hand trowel, carving out precise, deep pockets in the dirt. He felt the resistance of the ground against the metal, a tactile war between his ambition and the dry earth. He dropped the seeds in, one by one, and pulled the loose dirt over them like a blanket. He patted the mound flat. He did not rush. He repeated the process for every inch of the row, his breath steady, his eyes locked on the dark line of earth he had just transformed. He stood up, wiped the grit from his palms, and looked at the rows. Life was now buried beneath the surface, waiting for the rain. The days stretched into weeks, each marked by the same routine. Paul walked the rows every morning, his eyes scanning the surface for any sign of change. The soil remained unbroken, a flat, tan expanse that mocked his efforts. He checked the moisture levels, kneeling to press his palm against the dirt, feeling only the dry, indifferent heat. Doubt began to settle in his chest, heavy and cold. On the 21st day, he reached the third row and stopped. A tiny, jagged break in the surface caught his attention. He leaned in, holding his breath, his shadow falling over the spot. A pale, curled sliver of green pushed through the grit. It was infinitesimal, barely a fraction of an inch, but it was alive. Paul did not move for a long time. He watched as the sun rose higher, casting light that made the sprout stand out against the parched ground. He moved to the next row, then the next, finding more of them small, defiant points of life, breaking the crust. He hauled a bucket of water, his movements careful and measured. He poured a thin, precise stream at the base of each shoot. The earth drank it greedily. He stood up, his legs aching from the crouch, and looked across the field. The yellow expanse was no longer just dust. It was a nursery. He wiped his brow, his hands trembling slightly, and began the long walk to fetch more water. The midday sun hit the valley with a white, searing intensity that threatened to wither the fragile shoots before they could take hold. Paul watched the leaves curl under the relentless glare. He knew the soil could not hold the moisture long enough against such heat. He moved to the edge of the plot where the wild, sun-bleached stalks grew in the hard pack. He pulled them by the handful, their dry stems rasping against his palms. He returned to the rows and began to weave the stalks together, fashioning small, upright shields. He drove them into the dirt at an angle, angling them to cast long, cooling shadows over the green slivers. He worked with rhythmic precision, moving from one plant to the next, adjusting the angle of each screen as the sun shifted overhead. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely focused on the survival of the crop. He checked the soil beneath the shade. The dirt felt cooler, damp to the touch. The plants stopped curling. They stood upright, reaching toward the filtered light. Paul stood back, his shoulders aching from the hours of hunching. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dark earth across his forehead. He did not leave the field. He stayed, tending the shadows, watching the growth of the shoots as they deepened their roots into the earth he had fought so hard to reclaim. Paul stepped back to the edge of his plot and looked out across the valley. It was a vast, unbroken expanse of yellow dust, shimmering in the heat haze. Beyond his perimeter, the land looked abandoned. He watched a dust cloud trail behind a departing truck, carrying away yet another family toward the distant factories. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the dry hiss of wind over parched earth. He turned his gaze back to his own field. It was a sharp, vivid island of green in a sea of brown. The rows he had nurtured stood firm, their leaves broad and healthy, catching the light in a way that felt like a challenge to the drought. He knelt to adjust a stone lining the irrigation path, ensuring every drop of his stored water remained trapped within his borders. He stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers, feeling the grit under his nails. He scanned the horizon once more. The rest of the world seemed to be fading into the dust. But here, the life he had cultivated continued to push upward. He picked up his tool, his grip firm, and walked the length of his rows. The contrast was undeniable. While the valley slept in the grip of the sun, his patch was awake, growing and waiting. The heat did not just radiate from the sun. It seemed to rise from the very pores of the earth. By mid-afternoon, the air grew thick, taking on a heavy, metallic quality that pressed against the skin. Paul paused in his work, leaning on his hoe. He noticed the usual chirping of cicadas had vanished. The valley was unnervingly quiet. He looked up, shielding his eyes, but the sky remained a flat, blinding blue. He drew a breath, but the air felt dense, difficult to pull into his lungs. He walked to the edge of his plot, his boots crunching loudly in the dry, brittle soil. A single large bird circled high above, then suddenly dived, disappearing into the shelter of the distant hills. Paul wiped the sweat from his neck, feeling a strange, prickling sensation on his arms. The wind, which had been a constant, dry companion for weeks, died completely. The tall yellow grasses beyond his fence stopped swaying. Everything held its breath. Paul stood motionless, watching the horizon. A thin, dark line began to smudge the edge of the sky, barely visible against the glare. He narrowed his eyes, tracking the movement of the distant haze, sensing that the long, relentless, dry spell was reaching its final breaking point. The thin, dark line on the horizon expanded, devouring the blue with alarming speed. Within minutes, the sky underwent a violent transformation. The steady, blinding light dimmed, replaced by a deep, bruised purple that cast long, distorted shadows across the field. Paul dropped his hoe, the metal ringing sharply against a stone. He looked upward, watching the clouds churn and collide, forming massive, heavy banks that seemed to sag under their own weight. The air pressure plummeted, his ears popped, and the sudden drop in temperature made the sweat on his skin feel like ice. He scrambled to gather his scattered tools, tossing them into the shed just as the first heavy, singular drops of water struck the dry dust. Each impact left a crater the size of a coin. The purple deepened to an ink black, and a low, resonant rumble vibrated through the ground, shaking the very roots of his crops. He stood at the threshold of the shed, watching the horizon vanish behind a curtain of falling grey. The clouds had finally broken, and the sky began to pour with a sudden, overwhelming force that turned the parched valley into a landscape of immediate, surging danger. The first drops were not a gentle soaking. They hit the earth like lead pellets, shattering the dry surface and kicking up clouds of choking dust. Paul reached out a hand, palm upward, feeling the cold sting of the water against his skin. It was relentless, heavy, and immediate. He stepped into the field, hoping to channel the moisture toward the roots of his young plants, but his boots sank instantly. The ground, baked into a hard crust by weeks of sun, refused to drink. Instead, the water pooled on the surface, shimmering in the fading light. He watched in disbelief as a thin, muddy film began to creep across the rows. He kicked at a small mound of dirt to create a path, but the water bypassed his intervention, carving its own jagged route through the silt. The sound was deafening now, a steady, rhythmic roar that drowned out the wind. Paul looked down at his feet, realizing the soil was becoming a slick, unstable slurry. He tried to move toward the center of the plot, but his footing gave way. The earth beneath him shifted. He scrambled for balance, his fingers clawing at the air, realizing that this was no longer a harvest-saving rain, but a destructive force he was powerless to stop. A deep, guttural groan rose from the earth as the hillside above the plot surrendered to the deluge. The boundary wall collapsed in a spray of stone and sod, and a wall of thick, liquid mud surged forward. It moved with the weight of an oncoming train, grinding over the rows of corn and tomatoes. Paul lunged forward, throwing his weight against the current to shield the fragile green shoots he had nursed for weeks. His hands plunged into the slurry, feeling the stems snap under the pressure. The mud was icy, heavy, and impossible to hold. It slammed into his chest, forcing the air from his lungs and dragging his feet from the soil. He tumbled backward, his back hitting the wet ground as the surge crested over his legs. In seconds, the work of months vanished. The vibrant green leaves were smothered, pressed deep into the suffocating layer of grey silt. The field, once a testament to his labor, became a flat, featureless expanse of sludge. He pushed himself upright, gasping for breath, and looked out over the wreckage. Where rows of life had stood, only a thick, dark silence remained. The water continued to pour, churning the surface into a swirling brown vortex that erased every trace of his progress. Paul remained standing in the center of the field, though the ground beneath him had long since turned to liquid. His feet slid across the submerged rows, finding no purchase in the shifting silt. The deluge was absolute. It fell in sheets so thick that the horizon vanished, leaving him trapped in a small grey circle of chaos. Water hammered against his shoulders, cold and relentless, soaking through every layer until he felt the weight of it pulling him down. He reached out to steady himself, but his hands found only the slick, heavy slurry that had replaced his soil. A sudden swell of runoff surged past his knees, threatening to knock him off balance. He braced his legs, digging his heels into the mud, fighting for a single moment of stability. The water rose higher, swirling around his waist, carrying away the remnants of his tools and the last signs of his work. He could not move against the pressure. He could only endure it. He stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with jagged, shallow breaths, his eyes fixed on the dark water as it claimed the final remnants of his labor. The roar of the rain filled his ears, a constant, crushing sound that stripped away any hope of intervention. He was a statue in the storm, watching the earth disappear beneath the rising tide. The flood did not just submerge the land, it dismantled it. Paul watched as the current intensified, transforming the surface into a churning, violent river. A section of the wooden fence, his only remaining anchor, shuddered under the relentless pressure. With a sharp, splintering crack that pierced the roar of the rain, the wood snapped and was swept away into the dark. It spun once in the heavy water before vanishing entirely. The debris field expanded, catching up bits of soil, broken stalks, and fragments of his equipment. Everything he had nurtured over 2 years was being harvested by the storm. He stared at the spot where the fence had stood, seeing only the swirling, opaque surface of the water. The current pulled harder, clawing at the very foundation of the plot. He watched the last rise of firm ground dissolve, turning into a liquid mass that flowed toward the lower valley. There was no resistance left to offer, no point of reference to hold on to. The landscape he knew was being rewritten in real time, erased by the sheer volume of the deluge. He stood paralyzed as the final remnants of his life's work were pulled into the murky blackness, leaving nothing behind but the cold, indifferent movement of the floodwater. The sky broke as suddenly as it had darkened. The roar of the rain faded into a drip, then a drip-drop, then nothing. A heavy, ringing silence settled over the valley, more intrusive than the storm had been. The water began to retreat, pulling away from the high ground with a slow, thick sound like heavy breathing. Paul remained where he was, his boots locked in the cooling sludge. As the surface drained, the landscape revealed its new face. The vibrant green was gone. In its place lay a flat, uniform expanse of grey silt, glistening under the returning light. It was thick, heavy, and already beginning to crust. He stepped forward, and his feet sank inches deep into the suffocating layer that had settled over every row he had planted. The silt had filled the furrows, leveled the mounds, and smothered the very texture of the earth. He reached down, pulling his hand back as it came away coated in a grey, viscous paste. Nothing moved, nothing grew. The silence was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed against his chest. He stood in the center of the ruin, the cold silt creeping over the arches of his boots, looking out at a field that was no longer a field, but a graveyard of possibilities buried under a foot of suffocating grey mud. Paul stared at the horizon, but his eyes found no purchase. The vast grey expanse of silt stretched out, mocking the 2 years of labor he had poured into the soil. Each breath felt weighted, dragging through the damp air. He tried to take a step, but his legs felt heavy, as if the mud were reaching up to hold him in place. The conviction that had driven him through every sunrise began to fracture. He shifted his weight, his boots sliding sideways in the slick, unstable sludge. There was no resistance left to push against. He let his knees buckle, dropping down into the cold, wet weight of the field. His palms hit the surface, sinking deep into the thick, grey grime. He did not brace himself. He let his weight drop fully into the earth, his fingers clawing through the paste, searching for a trace of the life he had buried. He found only grit, sediment, and the cold, unyielding reality of total failure. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and the silence of the valley pressed down on him like a physical blow. He gripped the earth, his knuckles white against the dark, muddy surface, feeling the absolute stillness of a dream that had been completely and utterly erased. The cold paste began to harden against his palms. It was a thick, clammy sensation that seeped through his skin, a reminder of everything lost. He stayed there for a long count, his breath hitching in the damp air. Then, the mud on his cheek began to itch as it dried in the wind. He reached up, his hand came away slick with grey sediment. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the grime, but his eyes cleared. He stared at the horizon. The field was still a disaster, but the sky had shifted to a pale, piercing blue. He planted his palms firmly into the silt, testing the ground. It held. He pushed. His muscles strained against the weight of his own exhaustion. He shifted his center of gravity, brought one knee up, then the other, and forced himself into a crouch. His boots slipped once, twice, but he dug his heels into the firmer earth beneath the sludge. He stood. His back ached, his lungs burned. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the expanse of ruin. He was covered in filth, shivering in the sudden breeze, but he did not slump. He stared at the mud, then turned his head, surveying the landscape, not for what was destroyed, but for the shape of the land beneath. He gripped the shovel, the handle slick with leftover grit. He did not aim for the center of the field. Instead, he paced the perimeter, watching how the remaining puddles drained toward the eastern slope. He walked the path of the water, tracing the natural contours of the valley floor with his heel. He began to dig. The first slice of the blade was slow, biting into the hardened silt. He worked with a rhythm, throwing spadefuls of dirt to the side to create a raised barrier. He dug for hours, his muscles adjusting to the repetitive strain. A hidden ridge of limestone blocked his path near the well. He stopped, wiped his brow, and adjusted the angle of his trench, funneling the slope around the obstruction. The work was demanding, requiring constant adjustments to the depth and slope of the channel. He dug until his hands blistered and his breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. By sunset, a deep, precise trench cut through the field. It was not just a ditch, it was a vein. He stood back, leaning on his shovel, and watched the last of the surface water pool into the channel. He had stopped fighting the terrain and started using it. The water no longer threatened to bury his future. It now had a path to follow. The work on the channels had become a quiet, steady habit. Paul was clearing a blockage near the boundary line when he heard the rhythmic groan of wood under stress. A few yards away, Mr. Thomas stood by his perimeter fence, pushing against a sagging post. The structure was tilting, the crossbeams snapping under the pressure of the shifting ground. Paul watched for a second, then dropped his shovel. He crossed the distance in a few long strides. The fence gave a sharp, splintering crack as he arrived. He did not ask. He simply moved into the gap. He pressed his shoulder against the heaviest beam. His boots slid on the loose dirt, so he kicked them into the earth to find a stable anchor. He pushed. The wood resisted, groaning under the strain of years of rot. His muscles surged, veins standing out on his forearms as he locked his posture. He leaned his weight into the beam, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the rough, weathered grain. The fence groaned one last time and held. Mr. Thomas looked over, his face lined with fatigue, But his grip on the neighboring post tightened in sync with Paul. They held the structure upright together. In that steady, silent pressure, the boundary between their individual struggles began to dissolve. The structural groan of the fence subsided into a dull, stable creak. Paul held the pressure for a long moment, ensuring the posts were firmly seated in the damp earth before he finally relaxed his grip. His arms hung heavy at his sides, his breath slowing to match the quiet of the afternoon. Mister. Thomas wiped his forehead with a rough cloth and let go of the beam. He did not walk away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his work trousers and pulled out a small, folded fabric bag. The material was stained from years of use, the drawstrings frayed at the ends. He held it out, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the object into Paul's palm. Paul took it, feeling the distinct, dry weight of seeds inside. He loosened the knot, peering into the bag at the small, varied shapes of the grains. These were not the mass-produced variety found in the shops. They were survivors, passed down through generations of valley storms and droughts. Paul looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. There was no need for speech. The weight of the bag in his hand felt like a promise. He tightened his fingers around the fabric, tucked it securely away, and turned back toward his own plot. The work of survival was done. The work of harvest was about to begin. Paul returned to the plot with the fabric bag. He did not scatter the seeds blindly. He knelt and pressed each one into the earth with deliberate pressure. The soil had changed. It no longer crumbled into choking dust, but held together, damp and dark, against his palms. He spent the following weeks tending to the rows, clearing the last stubborn patches of grey silt that threatened to stifle the new life. By the second month, a thin emerald haze appeared across the valley floor. The sun beat down, but the moisture held deep in the trenches he had dug, feeding the roots from below. Time moved faster now. The stalks gained height with every passing week, their leaves unfurling to catch the morning light. By the third summer, the transformation was absolute. The yellow parched landscape of the past was gone, erased by a rolling tide of deep, healthy green. Rows of corn stood shoulder high, their thick leaves rustling in the breeze like a steady, rhythmic applause. Paul walked between the rows, his boots sinking into soft, fertile ground that felt alive under his feet. The air no longer tasted of grit and decay. It was heavy with the scent of damp earth and growing things. He looked out across the expanse, watching the green canopy sway, and saw the valley breathing again. Paul moved deeper into the thicket of green, his hands brushing against stalks that were now taller than his own reach. He paused at the edge of the tomato patch. The vines were thick, tangled, and heavy with bounty. Clusters of red-skinned tomatoes hung like weighted lanterns, pulling the branches down toward the rich soil. He reached out to lift a cluster, feeling the smooth, firm skin of the fruit against his calloused palms. One vine had begun to sag too low. He quickly grabbed a wooden stake, drove it into the earth, and tied the branch upright to keep the produce from touching the dirt. He moved down the line, repeating the motion, his movements practiced and efficient. Every step revealed more hidden clusters, glowing deep crimson against the dark foliage. The transformation of the valley was now complete and undeniable. Where there had once been only cracked, yellow dust, there was now a heavy, abundant weight of life. He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving faint smears of earth, and stood back to look at the rows. The vines were bowed low, strained by the sheer volume of the harvest. He had forced the land to yield its treasure, and for the first time, the ground was not just surviving, it was overflowing. Paul stepped back from the rows, his breath hitching in his chest. A light breeze swept through the valley, stirring the heavy leaves and carrying a new pervasive fragrance. He closed his eyes and inhaled the sharp metallic tang of dry dust and the sour, hollow smell of rot that had haunted this valley for years were gone. In their place, the air was thick with the rich, musky perfume of damp soil and active growth. It was a deep, earthy scent that clung to the back of his throat, grounding him. He knelt, taking a handful of the dark, crumbly dirt and letting it sift through his fingers. It felt cool, moist, and alive. Every inhalation brought the smell of success, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the past. He stood, shaking the remnants of the soil from his hands, and watched the wind ripple through the green canopy. The valley no longer smelled like a graveyard of failed ambitions. It smelled like a beginning. He took one more deep breath, savoring the change, before turning his attention to the crates waiting to be filled. The air was heavy, sweet, and fertile, a living testament to the work he had poured into the ground. The market square hummed with a kinetic, rising energy. Paul pulled his cart to the center of the plaza and lowered the heavy tailboard. He began the work of unloading, stacking crates of tomatoes and corn until they formed a vibrant, towering wall of color. The scent of the harvest drew the first villagers before he had even finished. Then came the others. A line formed, stretching past the stone fountain and winding around the corner of the square. The crowd grew restless, eyes fixed on the produce. Paul reached for a crate, his muscles tight from the morning transport, and positioned it at the front of the table. He felt the weight of the crowd pressing in, a palpable pressure that demanded more than he had initially planned to offer. He shifted a stack of corn, creating a secondary display to keep the flow moving. Every motion was precise, calculated to manage the bottleneck. He looked up, catching the eyes of neighbors who had once looked past his barren fields with pity, now staring at his table with genuine wonder. He reached into a crate, pulled out a firm, red tomato, and placed it on the scales. The line did not shorten, it only grew denser. He had brought the valley back to life, and today, the valley had come to collect. The roar of the market seemed to dip in volume, receding until it was nothing more than a dull, rhythmic pulse in the distance. Paul stood behind his table, his hands resting on the rough wooden edge, fingers tracing the grain. The air was still warm, carrying the faint, sweet trace of the harvest. He felt a firm pressure settle on his right shoulder. He did not turn immediately. He knew the weight, the deliberate, measured cadence of that touch. Mr. Thomas stepped into his line of sight, his weathered face etched with lines that mirrored the topography of the valley itself. The older man did not speak. He simply stood there, his hand remaining steady, a silent anchor in the middle of the shifting crowd. He looked from Paul's face to the overflowing crates of corn and tomatoes, then back again. His eyes narrowed, then softened, and he gave a slow, singular nod. It was a gesture that bypassed the need for words, a recognition of every hour spent hauling water and every day spent fighting the silt. The noise of the villagers clamoring for produce surged back into focus. But for this brief, suspended moment, the only thing that mattered was the weight of that hand and the quiet, undeniable gravity of the respect passing between them. The weight of the older man's hand lifted, but the air between them remained charged with purpose. Paul turned back to the table, his movements fluid and efficient. A woman stepped forward, clutching a worn basket, her gaze darting between the corn and the tomatoes. She hesitated, her hand hovering in the space between them, as if unsure whether she was allowed to take from such a bounty. Paul did not wait for her to ask. He picked up a wooden crate, the weight of the harvest straining his forearms, and slid it across the table until it rested in her grip. Her fingers tightened around the wood, and she looked up, a flicker of surprise breaking through her guarded expression. He nodded, a sharp, decisive motion that signaled this was not an exception, but the new standard. Behind her, the line shifted forward in unison. Paul reached for another crate, then another, handing them out with steady, rhythmic precision. With every transfer, the tension that had gripped the valley for years began to dissipate. He was no longer just a boy fighting the silt. He was the source of the valley's renewal. He watched as the woman turned and walked back into the crowd, her basket heavy with the product of his persistence, sharing the yield with those who had once shared his struggle. The sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the market square as the final villagers dispersed. The crates, once overflowing, were now empty skeletons of wood. Paul felt the deep, dull ache in his shoulders, a reminder of every hour he had spent in the dirt. He paused, lifting his hand to his forehead to wipe away the salt and grit of the long afternoon. He looked out past the square, toward the valley floor. Where there had once been only cracked earth and yellow dust, there was now a vibrant, living landscape. He drew a deep, steady breath, the air thick with the scent of damp, fertile soil rather than the dry rot of the past. He recalled the flood, the mud, and the crushing weight of the silt, but those memories no longer held the sting of defeat. They were simply the foundation. He looked down at his hands, calloused and stained by the work, and then back at the horizon. He had turned a dead patch of ground into a harvest, proving to himself and to the valley that persistence was the only path to the soil's gold. The land was alive again, and he was the one who had coaxed it back from the silence.